welcome to today's webinar, Sparking Innovation, the Power of Catalytic Capital to Reduce Food Waste. Thank you all for being here with us today, including the many members of the Food Waste Funder Circle who have joined us. My name is Caroline Vance, and I'm the Director of Capital Innovation and Engagement here at ReFed. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, ReFed is a national nonprofit that is working to end food loss and waste across the food system by advancing data-driven solutions to the problem, including seeking to activate the funding that we know is needed to help us meet our collective 2030 goal of cutting food waste in half. To help mobilize that capital, we launched the Food Waste Funder Circle in partnership with the Upcycled Food Association to help funders better understand the food waste reduction landscape, explore investment opportunities, and find partners for collaboration. It currently has 115 members spanning all funder types. Among other things, the offerings of the Funder Circle include a monthly deal flow report, which is currently tracking more than $300 million in grant and investment funding opportunities. We also hold pitch events featuring organizations that are highlighted in the deal flow report and quarterly webinars like this one today, where we focus on various topics of interest to our members and also to our other partners in this work. So ReFed's analysis shows that an investment of $14 billion is needed each year over the next 10 years to reach the nation's goal to reduce food waste by 50%. And in the process, we would be reducing GHG emissions by 75 million metric tons per year. Of that total 14 billion that is needed, we estimate that about 3 billion of that is catalytic capital, which will play a critical role in unlocking the additional 11 billion. Catalytic capital comes in all shapes and sizes, whether it's grants, equity investments, loans, etc. But the common thread is that it tends to be impact-focused, patient, flexible, and risk tolerant. All are characteristics that will allow that funding to have a multiplier effect that can stimulate larger amounts of future funding and help overcome system-level barriers. So why is catalytic capital so important in the context of food waste reduction? And so when we take on this challenge of reducing food waste, we are essentially seeking to recreate the food system in a way that eliminates or at least drastically reduces its waste. And that is not an outcome that the market can deliver by itself. So this slide is mapping out the estimated need for catalytic capital across the food value chain, which you see here broken down into categories of solution sets based on ReFed's research, from the farm on your left to end-of-life recycling on your right. The first 5 categories together represent prevention solutions, which aim to prevent food waste from happening in the first place. 44%, or about 1.4 of the 3 billion in catalytic capital required each year, is needed for these types of solutions. In particular, catalytic funding is needed here to prove out the viability of new and innovative products and models, or to pilot existing models in different contexts. We need to see more of this capital put to work in a wide range of areas, like supporting the ecosystem of organizations that are building new supply chains to upcycle edible byproducts of food processing operations, or imagining new solutions to make it easier for all consumers to reduce their food waste, just to name a couple of areas where there is still massive impact remaining to be had. The 6th category here names food rescue solutions, which redistribute food that is at risk of going to waste to people who are experiencing food insecurity. This is a category where flexible grant and investment funding can play a catalytic role in helping impact-focused organizations expand their programs, either by being willing to support exploration into new areas of work, by funding infrastructure development for the logistics of food rescue, and I'm talking about storage space, transportation, etc., or by funding the uptake of technology solutions to enable more effective donation matching and coordination, or by stepping in with flexible multi-year grant funding to allow organizations to focus on growing their impact instead of fundraising, to name a few examples. The final category here is for recycling solutions, which aim to repurpose any food scraps that remain as feed for animals, fuel, compost, or other useful purposes. In the US, our recycling infrastructure is highly underdeveloped. in part because we have been missing that flexible funding that could make the overall financial returns on composting and anaerobic digestion work for traditional investors to participate in. ReFed estimates that if centralized composting were fully implemented in the US, it could divert an additional 13.8 million tons of food waste each year, which would result in a reduction of almost 5 million metric tons of GHG emissions per year, and be equivalent to taking more than 1 million cars off the road annually. In addition, catalytic funders have the opportunity to de-risk new circular business models that repurpose scraps for animal feed, process them through insect farming, or recycle them into bioplastics, among other things. And of course, there is also a very important catalytic role for funding for policy work, research, convenings, and other initiatives that are the cornerstones of an environment that enables action. In case my enthusiasm hasn't made it clear, this topic is close to our hearts here at ReFed, and I'm thrilled to have a whole set of panelists here today who know a great deal about the role of catalytic capital. But more than that, they have deep experience in deploying it, and today we're keen to learn from them how to deploy catalytic capital for maximum net impact. As we take on the reimagining of our food system, we recognize that we need to be supporting solutions that work for all people, particularly for those whose voices have been historically marginalized, or we will never get rid of food waste. As a result, how we deploy capital matters deeply. We need to be designing our deployment processes in ways that maximize our ability to find and successfully support impactful solutions, particularly among leaders and founders who aren't traditionally recognized due to race, gender, or other factors. Otherwise, we will be leaving impact on the table in a way that is simply incompatible with the urgency of the problem. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dennis Price of ImpactAlpha, who will be moderating our panel. Dennis is the Chief Impact Officer at ImpactAlpha, a digital media company that provides news and intelligence for impact investors and sustainable financiers. Earlier, Dennis co-founded 118 Capital and worked with Media Development Investment Fund and the Global Impact Investing Network. He began his career in the Peace Corps in Armenia and at Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone. That is just a fantastic analysis overall, and particularly like identifying gaps, which I think we'll hear from the panelists, is capital gaps in a particular market, how important that is when deploying catalytic capital. But I just wanted to say one thing about the topic in general from a reporting standpoint. It's hugely popular with ImpactAlpha readers, which are investors and intermediaries. We like to say the cool kids now are clamoring to join the nerds or catch up to the nerds and the wonks to be catalytic investors. We increasingly see investors trying to outperform on impact, not just financial return. And catalytic capital is one way to do that. It's how impact investors can show their stuff, get deals done when others can't, help build markets. Okay, good. And last thing, just from a track record of catalytic investments that have now gone mainstream and have major impact, mRNA vaccines out of the Gates Foundation and others, electric vehicles, early Tesla funding was catalytic from a number of foundations. So you can understand why folks are increasingly looking at these categories. So let's bring in the pioneers and the practitioners. Quick introductions: Sarah Carney, who is the founder and executive director of Prime Coalition in Cambridge. It's a nonprofit intermediary Sarah founded more than a decade ago to mobilize and catalyze capital to fill a major funding gap in early stage climate tech innovation. So lots of lessons Sarah can share here. Sarah and Prime have mobilized over 200 million for climate tech innovation. And I believe I first started covering Sarah in 2016. I was looking up the first article we wrote. So we've been on a journey together, so to speak. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here. Also happy to be a cheerleader for ReFed. Woo!
Great, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Angel Vesa is a Senior Manager of Capital Innovation and Engagement at ReFed. She's leading the development of ReFed's targeted $20 million Catalytic grant fund to catalyze capital around food waste solutions. She has previously managed ReFed's COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund, which deployed $3.5 million to 37 food waste for-profit and nonprofit organizations at the height of the pandemic. Welcome, Angel.
Thanks, Dennis. Really excited to be part of this panel.
Fantastic. And Margot Kane is the Chief Investment Officer at Spring Point Partners, LLC, an exciting social impact organization out of Philadelphia. Margot and Spring Point invest directly in companies as well as funds, including intentional investments in diverse fund managers to advance equity and justice, and using catalytic capital to do that. Margot's previously worked with Closed Loop Partners, Calvert Impact Capital, and is a recent author on ImpactAlpha. So welcome, Margot.
Thank you, Dennis. Happy to be here with you, Angel and Sarah.
Sarah, let's start with you, because it's a great sort of case study on what could be in food waste. Climate tech is sort of all the rage now in venture capital, but it hasn't always been like that. And you spotted an important capital gap in climate tech innovation financing. Why did it take Prime and Catalytic Capital to help fill this gap?
Man, I'm so excited to be here with you, Dennis, and with the ReFed team and all of us speaking together about a topic that has gotten me out of bed every day for the past decade. I'm going to start by saying a couple words of context just so attendees here know what I'm bringing with me to answering your question, but I will get back to your question. So as Dennis said, Prime's a nonprofit public charity. We have our roots in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but our team is scattered across the US doing virtual work. We mobilize catalytic capital for climate solutions, which is why I'm so energized about what ReFed is building. I see it as a wonderful leap forward toward the world that we at Prime would like to see, a world with many more options for philanthropists to deploy catalytic capital toward market-driven solutions in a variety of forms, with each intervention purpose-built for the specific problem at hand and marshaled by a team of experts at that exact problem. I think there should be as many products and services offered to impact first asset owners as there are for finance first asset owners. And at Prime, we've completed impact first investment transactions now with over 250 different philanthropic organizations. And we've deployed catalytic capital into 30 early stage companies that each hold promise for mitigating global emissions at the gigaton scale. So because the topic is food waste, I have to mention that 2 of our 30 portfolio companies so far relate to food waste. The first is Rebound Technologies, which focuses on flash freezing when produce hits the cold storage facility. And if produce doesn't freeze fast enough, it goes bad. But we need to do that in a process that won't ruin the planet. And then our second is Clean Crop Technologies, which focuses on increasing yield and shelf life without loss of quality for nuts, ground beef, and seeds. Okay, back to your question. So back in Q3, Q4 of 2013, when I was sitting alone in the basement of MIT reading the tax code, I think that officially makes me either the nerd or the wonk that you think the cool kids are catching up to. Thomson Reuters reported $0 of initial investment into anything flagged as clean tech for venture capital firms. So there had been high profile failures in venture capital and government investment portfolios in the early 2000s that made clean tech untouchable for the venture asset class at that time. I discovered this incredible opportunity for philanthropists that care about charitable impact above all else to step into that void. But there had been less than 10 program-related investment transactions in any area of science and engineering innovation at that time. So we started matching courageous impact-first asset owners with companies that were not going to be able to raise sufficient financial support without us, but whose solutions could make a dent on global greenhouse gas emissions. So now that climate tech is, as you said, all the rage, first and foremost, I'm overjoyed, both from a macro perspective for the world and all its people, but also very micro around and selfishly around Prime's portfolio, because we have totally nailed our goal to crowd in follow-on investors. I don't think we can take credit for most of that. The world has moved around us in an extremely helpful way. But as long as we can ensure that a company will be able to stay on the impact path that Prime cares about, we love seeing companies graduate from additionality. That's the whole point. So there are still hidden corners of early stage venture that require catalytic capital, even while climate tech is all the rage. But more importantly, Prime is in a different position today with the momentum of the catalytic capital movement behind us, where we can contemplate additional gaps like first of a kind projects that are now facing an acute capital gap because climate tech venture capital is all the rage. So what's important to me is that Prime is viewed as a philanthropist's engine to do the hard intermediation work, like what ReFed is doing around substantiating capital gaps, designing the right intervention, constructing that intervention, fundraising, and implementing the right catalytic capital program for the moment, based on what's going on both in private finance first investment land and with public investment. So what a time to be alive on both private and public climate investment right now.
I mean, and I do think you're a bit too humble in acknowledging the role Prime has played here, because I want to get into some examples of some of your follow-on investors and investments. Because what you do is very intentional, right from the beginning. And so I think we want to examine here some of the how in catalytic capital. So how do you, from the get-go, increase the likelihood of successful impact on the one hand, but also commercial success of, let's say, a private company that you're investing in that other VCs won't touch at the moment? How do you increase the likelihood of both impact and commercial success from the get-go?
So I want to start by level setting and saying that we only prioritize commercial success of our investment if and only if it is tied to impact outcomes. So we do not prioritize commercial success if it's not tied to impact outcomes. There's a huge body of work and lessons learned about the difference. And we now keep a very close eye from a governance standpoint on portfolio companies that we believe are in lockstep and those that are not in lockstep with our nonprofit impact goals. So a lockstep company, in our definition, is one where there is no opportunity to veer off of Prime's desired impact track. So they are and could only develop products and services that lead directly to the large-scale emissions reductions that we're seeking. So even with lockstep companies, and my fellow panelists are much more expert on this, but there is a huge body of work that our investment managers need to do with company leadership around both social co-benefits and unintended social consequences alongside our focus on emissions. And then secondly, a company that's not in lockstep is one where there might be one or more products, services, or markets that might distract from the large-scale emissions impact. So there's a huge amount of hard work that we put into ensuring that we use our influence as early investors to keep the high impact path on track. This is one of the primary motivators about why our most recent fund paired a catalytic sleeve alongside a non-charitable sleeve so that we could imagine using our influence longer into companies' lives to ensure fidelity to Prime's original intention of impact outcomes. So the whole category of impact measurement and management activities around forward emissions impact is complex and nascent. It's why, alongside our own investment activities, we constructed a program called Project Frame. That's a community, I know you've covered it, Dennis, of investment managers that are coming together around best practices. So as of July 2022, Frame consists of over 200 members from 5 continents. It's 80 venture capital or private equity firms, and it's $40 billion in investment capital dedicated to climate. So I say that here because we would welcome anyone that wants to join in that community. It's at projectframe.how, and it's like purpose focused on exactly your question.
And say one more, I think a bit deeper there on, I can't think of it at the moment, but you have a metric that you use to gauge future potential impact, or, you know, and I think it's in the emissions realm. But I mean, when we're thinking about applying catalytic capital to other sectors, something like this is extremely, I mean, this is tailored to your focus on emissions, but the idea and the calculation, I'd imagine could be useful elsewhere.
Yeah, I hope so. You know, even just within our very, and I should say that our underwriting criteria is focused on emissions reduction, but we contemplate both pre-investment decision and post-investment decision, many other social metrics. We think of them as like co-benefits and co-risks to emissions. Even just within that narrow emissions focus, it is so complex to think about emissions reduction potential of a new solution for a whole industry. So that we call that emissions reduction potential. And then it gets even more tricky and difficult to think about what part of that emissions reduction potential is actually captured by the one company that you are diligencing and tracking and reporting against. And then how does your calculation around emissions reduction potential, emissions reductions planned, how does that translate into emissions reductions realized, and kind of tie into the very large body of work that's been done about historical emissions reduction and reporting. So again, that's all kind of the complexity that's been really nice to have community around, because there are a lot of firms that not only want to do it, but their own LPs are asking them for it. And I think we're all going to just have to do it in the future. So project frame is resources. It's not judgment, but it's because we kind of see judgment coming.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And we'll come back to you with the Fuller Group in a bit. But Angel, I want to bring you in. You are building a new catalytic fund for food waste solutions. Tell us more about it and how you're thinking about the spaces within food waste that it will be most beneficial for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, happy to kind of share where it's at now and those opportunities. So as Caroline mentioned, you know, roughly $3 billion in catalytic capital is needed annually if we're going to achieve our goal of reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. And so REFET saw an opportunity to really leverage its network and knowledge and past experience with the COVID-19 Food Waste Solutions Fund to launch its own catalytic grant fund strategy to help close this funding gap. And so the grant fund is expected to provide recoverable and non-recoverable grants, and it will provide capital to all solution types from across the value chain. And the deployment strategy is really built upon the research and analysis that we've done that underlies our REFET Insights engine. And so far, we've had some pretty good momentum, right? We've, with the initial funding that REFET received from Anchor Funder Google and the Betsy and Jesse Fink Family Foundation, we've been able to announce the fund with an initial demonstration portfolio of 2 nonprofit organizations, Upcycled Food Association and Food Recovery Network, as well as 1 for-profit startup, Hidden Gems. And so together they span the prevention, rescue, and recycling solution spectrum. Now looking ahead, we're aiming to hold our initial open call for applications this fall. And as far as where we see a particular need for catalytic grants, in terms of prevention, one area is really enabling consumers to actively reduce food waste, whether that be at home or in restaurant and food service settings where we know post-consumer plate waste is a real challenge. And ultimately, we know that consumers are the largest generators of food waste. So there's just this big opportunity there. Looking at food rescue, Caroline mentioned funding infrastructure development, which is absolutely right. But we're also seeing an opportunity for catalytic grant funding to support the development of efficient rescue and donation of otherwise wasted nutritious foods to food insecure individuals and communities in a really dignified way. And then in terms of food waste recycling solutions, we're finding that there could be a need for smaller scale local recycling solutions where catalytic grant funding could launch thoughtfully cited composting initiatives, which could in turn spark a cascade of follow-on positive impacts like job creation and community engagement. But also grant funding could support large-scale infrastructure projects for a composting facility that could then attract other funders in such a way that the financial return would make sense for them, and just with a little bit of grant funding to start. That's kind of what we're seeing. Yeah.
Great. And Caroline mentioned at the start, catalytic capital can be in the form of equity that takes perhaps greater risk, debt that's lower cost, guarantees. Why grants, and how do you see grants playing a role in catalyzing impact, but also potentially crowding in commercial capital down the road?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we see grants being catalytic in the way that they can support solutions that are not traditionally appropriate for market rate investments, and grow a pipeline of investable opportunities by de-risking early stage market-based solutions. So to give an example of catalytic capital action with prevention solutions, the $100,000 grant, research grant funding that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided to Appeal in 2012, right? It was to reduce post-harvest food waste in the global South. And now Appeal has grown to be a widely recognized leader in shelf life extension and saving like 33 million pieces of fruit from going to waste at grocery stores, I think it was in 2021. So that's just one example of how we've seen grants over the long term be really catalytic.
That's a great case study, success story. You've been in building this fund, you've been talking to a lot of folks about the needs in terms of flexible capital, but also other investors that have been deploying it. What are you learning about, what do you hear, like what are your sort of takeaways, and what are you planning to incorporate into your own processes to increase the impact of what you're doing?
Yeah, we've been really inspired by trust-based philanthropy. And so we saw this opportunity to challenge how grant making has been done historically. So we started to strategize and craft the operations and processes, and realized, we have a solution provider directory with over 1,500 food waste solution providers that are on the ground doing the work. Let's just have a conversation with them about this. And so we hosted a virtual listening tour, and I would say we gained insights that probably would have taken years of mistakes and iterations to figure out on our own. So it's just a really valuable exercise. And if I were to highlight like one critical takeaway, it would be that we found that we really need to develop a thoughtful and efficient process for everyone involved in our Catalytic Grant Fund. We're talking the applicants, grantees, the team managing the fund, external stakeholders, and within that, really establishing procedures that promote transparency and flexibility. And I think Caroline described it well, that we're essentially trying to recreate the food system in a way that eliminates waste. And so that's going to require a systems level approach, one in which all organizations are involved, not just the established ones that have already demonstrated impact. And we need to ensure that everyone is aware and has access to the grant fund opportunity, that the application process is phased and transparent so that we're not wasting people's time, that the criteria and evaluation aren't favoring one type of organization over others, and a lot of different components. And I just will say that I've mentioned transparency a couple of times now, and that's because what we're learning is that increased transparency improves communication and alignment between the grant maker and the grantee on our theory of change and our strategy. So overall, by aligning our work with our strategy, we're setting ourselves and our partners up for long-term success, because we know we're not necessarily going to see immediate impact with our funding right now. And I'll give a couple of examples of how we're planning to increase that transparency in our work. So one way we're doing this is through our application process. And with each question in our application, we're providing the rationale for why we're asking that question. And doing this achieves two things. One, it forces us as the grant maker to consider whether or not we really need this information, or if we're just requesting it because it's a question that's typically asked. And as a result, this pares down that demand on the applicant. And it also decreases any potential misinterpretations of the question, which then helps ensure that we're getting the most accurate information that we need, and we're not wasting people's time. And so building off of that, we're also establishing procedures that will enable us to provide tailored feedback to each applicant that receives a decline from us, because we believe that the time and effort it takes to provide that customized feedback is going to help them improve and thus get us all closer to achieving our shared goal of reducing wasted food in the long term.
Really driving home the point that how catalytic capital is deployed is as important as the type of capital and the capital itself. So it sounds like you all are focused on building that right. Just a reminder, there's going to be a opportunity at the end for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat or to someone directly, and we'll aggregate them and address them a bit later. But Margot, I wanted to bring you up. You sit in a different, slightly different part of the ecosystem. You work with an owner of capital as opposed to an intermediary like Prime and Refed. What motivates Springpoint to be catalytic with its assets, with its capital? And are you seeing more and more of your peers, so to speak, clamoring to outperform on impact?
Thank you, Dennis. And I just am so honored to be on this panel with such amazing, dedicated practitioners with Angel and Sarah. I'm so impressed by what you guys are building. So, you know, I think that's part, honestly, of why our founders and directors initially founded us with an impact-first approach, which enables catalytic investing. Our approach has evolved. I think that's the case with everybody who starts off with the intent to be impact first, but knowing that there's almost no, you know, universally applicable blueprint. It by necessity changes over time. Today, I think it's really grounded in the worldview of our directors and our organizational mission, which focuses on transformational leaders and solutions. So we center it on our partners and how and when we can provide them with different kinds of support that they need. So it requires us to be flexible wielders of different tools and types of support in ways that can realize or accelerate their vision, their evolution, their impact for the communities and the folks that they're working with. This also necessitates sort of approach, which is somewhat encapsulated in our values. So two of our core values are learning and humility. Actually, a third one is people focused, so that when we do come to the table to deploy capital, we're coming with the mindset of how are we helping these people? Like, how are we helping our partners? How are we showing up as the best possible supports? Instead of, I think, kind of a more classical investment mindset when you're deploying market rate or other types of capitals, what can you do for us? And although most of our investment work today is really focused on economic and wealth justice and leaders that are trying to drive solutions that close the racial wealth gap in this country, we have had the privilege of learning so much from the really deep expertise that Refed has been developing over the past several years. And also we do really love what we learn from one of our portfolio companies that's very active in the space. Spoiler alert.
You've highlighted there one thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the value of intermediaries like Refed, like Prime, someone who, an organization and folks who are looking at the capital gaps and the need on the one hand, but doing the work to also bring flexible capital to the table, the coordination that happens. What are how is that valuable to you as an asset owner and trying to be catalytic with your funds?
100%. I think the value of intermediaries is often underestimated or understated, but I think two examples that Sarah and Angel both pointed to, for example, is that catalytic capital, when you're trying to deploy catalytic capital, the concept, in fact, in the name of it, implies that it's for the moment, right? So to Sarah's point, it's a point in time. You're trying to bridge ideas, models, and teams to a place where they're going to be more sustainable. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a market-based sustainable model. It could be a sustainable path to like public sector funding or what have you. But because of the nature of that being temporary, because of the nature of most asset owners, having life cycles to them in terms of strategic priorities, in terms of staffing, in terms of principles, these kinds of organizations don't have the staying power it takes to really drive these solutions over the kind of full maturity of getting them to that sustainable life cycle. That's one reason intermediaries are important, because you've got people who are really dedicated to these to see this through for the long haul. The second reason intermediaries are really important is they should be bringing, and I think in this case we certainly have that, they should be bringing on the ground insights, lived experience, and deep expertise. They should be practitioners. Where a lot of the catalytic capital sits is housed in institutions where most of the staff's time, frankly, is dealing with a lot of the internal demands on managing those assets and things involved with that. They're leanly staffed. They don't have the ability to get, to survey 1,500 companies the way that Angel and Refed did, that are deploying food waste solutions on the ground, and get that kind of real-time market information and insights. And that's particularly important when we're trying to fund solutions that affect people, which is most of the time, right? So if you don't have that feedback loop, that accountability loop at the investor level, you're going to want to be working with intermediaries that do have that, to hold yourselves accountable and to make sure that any solution that's funded, has real buy-in and support and insight from the people and the communities impacted by that solution. I think there are a couple of different ways in which intermediaries also serve like a critical just market infrastructure solution, which I think you guys have covered at ImpactAlpha. But the other, whenever there's like a new market, new solution, and particularly when there's a systems approach required, I think intermediaries play an invaluable role in helping make sure that we don't, repeat history, reinvent the wheel, and have everybody piling money into like one narrow set of solutions, when this kind of more holistic value chain, the way Refed laid out, is really required, and different folks can come in at different points to support those solutions.
In a recent post on ImpactAlpha, you aired out some critiques of impact investors who are trying to be or claiming to be catalytic, but then have an onerous process with investees that potentially sets back that ability to be catalytic. Can you say a bit more about that, and how you think and how you propose investors can get it right?
Sure. I will first say, though, that I hope I posited these as lessons. They're critical. Yeah. I include myself in that critique as an offending party. I think all of us in this field, we're operating without precedent, and we're trying to push the envelope on what's known, right? You're going to do things in ways you later wish you could have changed or done differently. And it's better to share those lessons now, honestly, so that we avoid repeating them or exacerbating them going forward. I have utmost sympathy for those working in institutions where deploying any kind of capital is incredibly laborious and painful, both for them and their partners. I do think that in order to deploy capital with a catalytic impact, your process is as important as the product. So thinking through the entire investment life cycle around, how does my process determine the kind of impact I'm going to have, not just the dollars you're putting out and the type of vehicle you're using, is step one. And that's kind of overwhelming. So you can kind of start it at the very accessible points, right? We're actually doing an audit of our process with one of our learners in residence, Chloe McKenzie, with an eye towards financial trauma, actually, and kind of where we need to improve, which I'm sure is going to be a lot of places. Another way to take a look at this is to look at deploying multiple tools. So not get like overly hemmed in with like your one, your one hammer. And we try to do that as well. We try to take a look at, okay, what would be most helpful for these partners at this point in time? And maybe it's a limited partner investment in their fund, and maybe it's that plus an investment in another entity to help them, fund their team, for example. Another thing is be really conscious about and honest about the value add that you bring to the table. We all know it's not just money, but when we've been asking, our partners what we could bring to the table to kind of accelerate their growth and success, the social capital that asset owners bring to the table is probably more important than the dollars at the end of the day. So how do you leverage your social capital? Do you open up, your list of co-investors and offer to make up to, or 5 introductions to everybody that you invest in? Do you share diligence? Are there other ways? Do you actually like lend them expertise that you have that they could use, that they've demonstrated an interest in? There's lots of different ways we can leverage our social capital that accelerates the catalytic nature of the investment. I think that evaluation and accountability is something that's pretty nascent on the asset owner side. We demand a lot of our partners on accountability around impact and evaluation, but generally I see less of that accountability happening at the asset owner level, particularly publicly. And I think taking the step and the brave step to improve your work and invite honest feedback and evaluation from your partners and from the communities that you're seeking to help is really essential to inform your strategy going forward and kind of keep us all, honest about like what's the nature of what we're doing or not doing. One of the things we're doing in setting our next investment strategy is inviting our portfolio partners to co-create it with us. And trying to, at very baby steps here, explore like what do more participatory models look like? Understanding that nobody has these answers. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson I would leave people with. There's not like a case book I can hand you and be like, okay, well, here's how to do it right. Your question, Dennis. I think the biggest thing is just, keep an open mind and question everything that you're doing with an acknowledgement that everyone you're working with is a person. We're all people. We're all in the same boat. We'll all be on both sides of the table. Value people's experience and try to support solutions and people that are closest to the problems that they're trying to solve. And we're all partners in this.
Thank you. Thank you to the full panel. We'll come back to the panel in a bit, but there's lots of good questions, and we're a bit pressed on time. And Charlie Cunningham, I don't know what organization you're with, but I love this question because, and it's a question about the Inflation Reduction Act. Because if you, for champions of catalytic capital, it was baked with, thinking about how to use public capital to incentivize private investment. And so to see catalytic capital inside the government, which, and Sarah can speak to, has been there in various ways. But this one was addressed to you, Margot, specifically, but I think anyone can ask, the specific question is, what is your perspective on how the government funds will affect private impact investment market? And that's, I guess, let's say from a catalytic perspective. And toss in a few of the other policies coming out of the administration, this influx of public catalytic funding.
I mean, there are a ton of ways in which it generally does this. I think government funding, including the funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, does at least, it's such a big question, but I'm going to start with just 3 potential ways, not include comprehensive. One is with the Justice 40 initiative. They are prioritizing funding streams to low-income, indigenous communities, communities of color, communities with environmental justice concerns, particularly when we think about the intersectionality, right, of climate and low income communities and other marginalized communities challenges.
Is the IRA subject to the Justice 40 initiative? I've been trying to actually dig that out myself. Don't worry if you don't have the answer.
I mean, I think most of what they're laying out through the agencies end up being reflective of the Justice 40 initiative, since it does eventually get translated through the agencies at some point.
The actual agency.
Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah, that's for policy wonk. Not me. I'm not smart enough for that. I guess part of the cool kid group. But I think that's one way that the federal. I'm not speaking specifically to that area. It's too much. The other thing that they can do really successfully is seed the ground for private investment. So, and specifically when we think about like projects, I mean, a lot of communities don't have the kind of like fundamental infrastructure in place to enable private investment, and private investment's not going to wait around for 5 years while you build a water main, right? So that kind of fundamental infrastructure is incredibly important. I think another piece that the government does, so there's the enabling, conditions on that fundamental infrastructure. There's the ensuring flows of capital are going to communities with greater need, which is fundamentally catalytic and enables more catalytic investors to then, piggyback on that. And then the final point is the secondary market point, which I don't think is a component of the IRA, although I could be wrong. And I think from a capital markets perspective, that's probably where the federal government historically has been the most catalytic in providing secondary markets for products like home loans, like the small business loans, SBA, like USDA guarantees, BI guarantees. They've enabled just a ton of private capital, deposit-backed capital to go into projects all over the country and kind of made markets, frankly, that otherwise would not have existed without that backstop. Sarah and Angel may have some more specific examples to the IRA.
We can move on too. There's other great questions here. Alex Kouari at ReFed has a good question, and this is where it gets wonky in catalytic capital. There's a concept in this industry around additionality. What Sarah can, or one of the panelists can maybe just define it, but it's like what can happen specifically because the existence of your money additionally to what was going to happen anyway. So that's sort of a big conversation in the industry, and I guess the question is, how do you measure that in your own investments, and what does that mean technically to be catalytic?
Dennis, do you want me to jump in first?
Yeah, I think I feel like we've talked about this before. Yeah,
big time. I'll start by saying that we don't only view additionality as a core underwriting criteria, but also as one of our organizational values. We just won't do something that we think someone else is doing, would want to do, or could do better. And it really is very present in like the day-to-day interactions of everyone on our team and how we think about anything. In the context of our investment programs, our catalytic capital investment programs, now that we've kind of done 3 different programs over the past 10 years, have a sense of the 5 phases that you need to go through to launch and implement one. And the 5 phases are substantiating, designing, constructing, fundraising, and implementing. And so the very first phase in our experience has taken us about a year just to substantiate and characterize exactly what the gap is. I loved the ImpactAlpha work that was published yesterday around kind of field level data for climate more broadly, trying to define capital gaps. Very relevant to that. In the context of Prime's investments themselves, we go to great lengths to substantiate in real time that this precious catalytic capital that we are stewarding is absorbing disproportionate risk or longer time horizons that others are not able to. And I think going to the previous question about government intervention, I think any catalytic capital intermediary has to think about that not only in terms of finance first private capital, but also public capital. And so we rely on field level data like the type beautifully displayed in the Capital Gaps Climate Mapping ImpactAlpha published yesterday. We also rely on what we call our Investment Advisory Committee. So this is a group of 25 active finance first venture investors that volunteer with Prime to tell us on a deal by deal basis the specific reasons that they would not be able to invest in specific companies in that moment. And it is just like the most amazing, energetic group that have been so dedicated to volunteering their time to do this because they're seeing the things they wish existed in the world that they cannot do. They also help us with the bridge to somewhere underwriting criteria of, if we can de-risk this in these specific ways, will that then allow you to come in so that we are not continuing to launch things into a void? I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Maggie Cutts, who's our director of partnerships. Our partnerships team is responsible not only for stewarding our relationships with philanthropists, but they are also the ones that do this additionality work. And I think those two functions of our organization, back to the how you do it, is really important to live together. Maggie and her team are putting on an additionality studio coming up, so I can share that link out for anyone in the audience that wants to hear more in a more nuanced way how Prime is thinking about additionality, what we've learned over time. We run additionality studios with all sorts of people, probably 5 times this year, because the definition needs to evolve, the circumstances evolve. But really the baseline question of what are the reasons this will not proceed without us is
that's the definition.
The baseline.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to bring back in Caroline shortly here, but one quick question to you, Angel, from Jason at Food Forward is the role of for-profits versus nonprofits in redesigning the food system, and what proportion of investment capital and funds needs to flow towards each, or do you anticipate flowing towards either or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is in terms of just the big picture, right? Both for-profits and nonprofits are really critical, and we see them playing key roles across the food system to solving food waste. My colleagues and I were just discussing there's an important role that nonprofits can play in helping those local, more community-based opportunities, whereas other solutions that have a business model attached to them are really designed for scale, and that's where for-profits are well designed for that. But at the end of the day, as you've been saying, it's really going to take everyone at the table to really address this issue right now.
All hands on deck. Okay, thank you, panelists. This is fantastic. Caroline, do you want to hop back on and close it out? And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you all so much. That was fantastic. I'm coming away feeling very inspired and activated, and I feel like there's hope for 2030, which is wonderful. So you'll see in just a minute a poll about to appear on the screen here for us to gather some feedback on today's webinar. And we really welcome your input since it really helps us with our future programming. And in case you're interested in learning more about ReFed's Catalytic Grant Fund that you heard Angel talking about today, please follow the link that's in the chat to our webpage. And you can also feel free to reach out to Angel at her email, which is also now in the chat. And as a reminder, today's event was hosted by the Food Waste Funder Circle, which is a network designed for private, public, and philanthropic funders who are interested in using their capital to solve food waste challenges. And if you're interested in joining the network, we really welcome you. Please follow the link in the chat. We will be hosting the Funder Circle's next pitch event on October 6th. and that will feature food waste startups that are seeking funding to scale their solutions. And you can also register for that in the link in the chat, and please join us. And we have another event to tell you about that's taking place just 2 weeks from today on International Awareness Day for Food Loss and Waste, appropriately enough. ReFed is a resource partner in the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, which is a public-private partnership between food businesses and jurisdictions along the West Coast to cut food waste in the region. We'll be co-hosting a special webinar with Andy Herrig of the Food Waste Reduction Alliance to share data on how much food goes to waste at the retail level, why it happens, where it's going, and how that information can be used by retailers around the country to jumpstart their own food waste reduction efforts. And you can register for that in the chat as well. And thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to seeing you at all of our future Funder Circle and future ReFed events. Have a wonderful day.